some attention in this case, especially online, has been deeply disturbing, as some have looked to celebrate instead of condemning this killer. Brian Thompson was a father to two. He was a husband, and he was a friend to many. And yes, he was the CEO of a health insurance company. In America, we do not kill people in cold blood to resolve policy differences or express a viewpoint.
That was Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, and what he said there was actually correct. We don't kill people in cold blood to resolve policy differences in America. But, outside of America, well, that's kind of a different story. Here's Governor Josh Shapiro in a weapons factory signing bombs that will be used to murder people. Sure, they're going to be dropped on Russian enemy combatants, but that doesn't change the fact that it's still deeply sad that people are going to die because of the imperialist ambitions of their despotic leader, Vladimir Putin, and he's kind of minimizing the tragedy of war by doing that. But having said that, Ukraine has the right to defend itself from Russia's illegal invasion. So Governor Shapiro probably rationalizes the use of those bombs as a necessary evil for purposes of self-defense. I get it. But when it comes to victims of a different invasion, Palestinians in Gaza who were invaded by Israel, well, in that case, he's taking the side of the imperialist invaders, like many U.S. politicians. But he just doesn't seem to have any sympathy whatsoever for Palestinians. And I say this because when he was in the spin room at the presidential debate representing Kamala Harris, he was asked about her comments on Israel, and he seemingly justified the genocide in Gaza. Listen.
For the Palestinians, they need to make clear that violence has no part in their relationship with Israel, that Israel has a right to exist. We need to get back to that kind of conversation, and I thought what the vice president did, laying that out, was really effective. Do you think that
she might change the weapons policy regarding to Israel?
She made very clear that Israel has the right to defend itself.
Right, but Israel isn't defending itself. They're not defending themselves when they bomb refugee camps and hospitals. Israel is doing a genocide. That's not self-defense. And that's not me saying this. That's the conclusion that human rights organizations have come to, such as Amnesty International. And this comes after the ICC has issued arrest warrants for the Israeli prime minister and former defense minister. It comes after they've killed more than 13,000 Palestinian children, including 6-year-old Hind Rajab, who was trapped in a car with her deceased family members and couldn't get out. And as NBC News reports, she spent hours on the phone with emergency services and her mother, begging to be rescued. 12 days later, once the area became accessible to rescuers, she was found dead in the back of the car, less than 50 meters away from the charred and blown out ambulance containing the remains of the 2 paramedics who were sent to rescue her. But in America, we don't kill people in cold blood. We just give Israel the weapons to do it in Middle Eastern countries under the pretense of self-defense. And if you've got a problem with your tax dollars being used to fund the extermination of the Palestinian people, you're not even allowed to object to it. Because when college students did just that, Josh Shapiro compared them to the KKK. But he is not the only genocide-supporting politician who's all of a sudden outraged by a murder. Senator John Fetterman, for example, who literally went to Israel to stand shoulder to shoulder with war criminal Benjamin Netanyahu, decided to condemn the CEO murder after spending the last year or so enthusiastically supporting genocide. He wrote on Twitter, "No shortage of shitty takes on the 2024 election or on this assassination. The public execution of an innocent man and father of 2 is indefensible, not inevitable. Condoning and cheering this on says more about you than the situation of health insurance." Yeah, so I guess if you don't feel sympathy for a multimillionaire CEO whose company killed people, who also had families, you're the one who's the bad person. Interesting. For no particular reason, let's see how much sympathy John Fetterman had when he was confronted about his material support for Palestinian murders in Gaza.
Senator, I always thought you were an anti-racist, but it seems like you value Israeli lives more than you value Palestinian lives. Is that true?
Still with Israel.
We're not changing. So there might be more different people that you may want to protesting around. Okay.
No.
I've been very clear. Wait, very clear. Senator, one question. Have you talked to any American?
I'm a Palestinian.
I'm going to respect your views. I ask you to respect mine.
That's not a.
It's the people.
Okay.
That's an inhumane view.
Being pro-genocide is not a view.
I'm a Palestinian. Why can't you look me in the face?
10,000 people in Gaza have been killed, half are children. The Pope's calling for a ceasefire. The UN has called for it. I'm just asking you. You're a good guy. I voted for you. I know you're a nice guy. This is important.
You need to leave.
Here, can I give you a phone?
That guy right there who voted to send weapons to a country doing a genocide thinks that he has a right to scold you for being immoral because you don't have any sympathy for a slain healthcare CEO. Wow, the audacity of these people. I bet that John Fetterman would support what Luigi Mangione did if you told him that the CEO was a Palestinian and Luigi Mangione was Israeli. In fact, you'd probably want to give Luigi some more weapons. But John Fetterman is just one of many senators with this same hypocritical stance. For example, Ted Cruz called it tragic and sick that online leftists were celebrating Luigi Mangione's assassination of a murderous healthcare CEO. But when it comes to the assassination of tens of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza, Ted Cruz says he condemns nothing that the Israeli government is doing, and this comes after he voted to also send them more weapons to kill more Palestinian civilians. And a lot of you watching are probably stunned by their shameless hypocrisy, but in their minds, there's nothing wrong with murder just so long as it's committed through the proper channels and against the people that they don't care about. See, if a random assassin shoots a CEO, that's very clearly murder because they can see him pull the trigger. But if a politician votes for bombs manufactured by their campaign contributors that are then sent to Israel and subsequently dropped on the heads of Palestinian babies, that's not murder in their minds because they were several steps removed from the person who pressed the button to drop the bomb. Now, if somebody gave Luigi Mangione a gun and then he used that gun in an assassination, sure, you're technically not directly responsible for the assassination yourself because you didn't pull the trigger, he did. However, if you gave him the weapon knowing what he was going to do with it, that'd make you a co-conspirator. But if you're a politician voting to give Israel bombs that you know they'll use in war crimes, you're not a co-conspirator in that scenario, apparently, in their minds. See, this is fundamentally why they think their hands are clean, even though they are indirectly responsible for far more deaths than Luigi Mangione. You could even argue that these politicians are co-conspirators in a genocide. They know that these bombs that they're voting to give to Israel are going to be used on hospitals, on refugee camps, but they're doing it anyway. That makes them co-conspirators, but yet they think that they can fix their mouths to condemn you for having no sympathy for a healthcare CEO. But like the UnitedHealth CEO, these politicians don't view him as a murderer because, like them, he was several steps removed from the deaths that he caused. He didn't pull the plug on a dying patient himself. A doctor did that after their claim was denied as a result of a corporate policy that he instituted to increase shareholder value. And what I'm getting at here is the concept of social murder by Engels, who assigns culpability to bosses and policymakers for the indirect deaths that their policies cause. He writes, since capital, the direct or indirect control of the means of subsistence and production is the weapon with which this social warfare is carried on, it is clear that all the disadvantages of such a state must fall upon the poor. For him, no man has the slightest concern. Cast into the whirlpool, he must struggle through as well as he can. If he is so happy as to find work, i.e. if the bourgeoisie does him a favor to enrich itself by means of him, wages await him, which scarcely suffice to keep body and soul together. If he can get no work, he may steal, if he is not afraid of the police, or starve, in which case the police will take care that he does so in a quiet and inoffensive manner. During my residence in England, at least 20 or 30 persons have died of simple starvation under the most revolting circumstances, and a jury has rarely been found possessed of the courage to speak the plain truth in the matter. Let the testimony of the witnesses be never so clear and unequivocal. The bourgeoisie, from which the jury is selected, always finds some back door through which to escape the frightful verdict, death from starvation. The bourgeoisie dare not speak the truth in these cases, for it would speak its own condemnation. But indirectly, far more than directly, many have died of starvation, where long-continued want of proper nourishment has called forth fatal illness, when it has produced such debility that causes which might otherwise have remained inoperative brought on severe illness and death. The English working men call this social murder and accuse our whole society society of perpetrating this crime perpetually. Are they wrong? And the answer is no. Social murder is a form of murder that's legitimized by the state. But make no mistake about it, it's still murder. Or at a minimum, it's complicity with deaths. And to make it more digestible, let me put it in meme format for you. So look at this modified version of the trolley problem. Every single day, politicians make a policy choice to not act. They could pull the lever and kill corporate profits, but they choose not to do that, so people die instead. They could implement a single-payer healthcare system, which would save about 68,000 American lives per year, but they are choosing to prioritize the profits of their health industry donors over our lives. And health insurance companies make that same decision every single day, and Americans know how ruthless and barbaric the system is, which is why they feel no sympathy for that slain CEO, and that's where the fundamental disconnect between the people and politicians come from. We view that event as a killer being killed, whereas politicians view the situation in a vacuum as a cold-blooded assassination, and that's it. Don't need to look any further into it. But it's not just politicians like Ted Cruz or John Fetterman who make this assessment. It's also pundits who happen to be in the same social class as these politicians. For example, Piers Morgan, a British man who's never had to worry about the cost of healthcare a day in his life, couldn't understand why an American journalist would celebrate the death of a health insurance CEO.
I do believe in the sanctity of life, and I think that's why I felt, along with so many other Americans, joy, unfortunately, because it feels like...
Serious?
I mean...
Joy in a man's execution?
Maybe not joy, but certainly not empathy. Because again,
we're watching the footage. How can this make you joyful? This guy's a husband, he's a father, and he's being gunned down in the middle of Manhattan. Why does that make you joyful?
Thousands of Americans that be murdered. So are the tens of thousands of Americans, innocent Americans, who died because greedy health insurance executives like this one push policies of denying care to the most vulnerable people. And the many millions of Americans that have watched people that I care about suffer and in some cases die because of lack of health care.
So should they all be killed then? Should they all be killed, these healthcare executives? Would that make you even more joyful?
No, that would not.
Well, why not?
And,
why are you laughing?
I think because it wouldn't fix the system.
You seem to find the whole thing hilarious.
I find your question funny.
A bloke's been murdered in the street. I don't find it funny at all.
I don't find it funny that tens of thousands of Americans die every year and because they are denied life-saving health care from people like the CEO. Now, I want to fix the system. You're right. We shouldn't be going around shooting each other with vigilante justice. No. I think that it is a good thing that this murder has led to America, or really the media elites and politicians in this country paying attention to this issue for the first time. You mentioned you couldn't understand why somebody would feel this reaction when they watched a CEO die. It's because you have not dealt, it sounds like, with the American healthcare system in the way that millions of other Americans have.
I've dealt with the healthcare system.
Sure you have. But look, even if he has dealt with the American healthcare system, I'm not familiar with his history. Maybe he lived here. His experience as a rich man with an estimated net worth of 20 million pounds is going to be very different than the experience of a working class American who doesn't have the money to foot the bill if their claim is denied, which could result in their death. But what's happening here is a thing I'd like to call Richsplaining, where wealthy politicians and pundits with the best healthcare money can buy feel entitled to police the feelings of those less fortunate than them, because they can't conceive of a scenario where someone went bankrupt or lost a loved one because of one of these companies. And rather than exploring the justifiable anger towards the system that people are vocalizing, these elites are instead choosing to clutch their pearls and scold us for our lack of sympathy. Instead of talking about issues with the American healthcare system that lead to that kind of a response that they're so distraught by, they'd rather talk about the way that this issue is going to affect people in their social class, elites, since they're more sympathetic to them than us. As this Forbes headline puts it, UnitedHealthcare CEO's killing highlights dangers of the top job. Or, as this San Francisco Chronicle article puts it, UnitedHealthcare CEO's killing highlights rising tech executive security costs. Yeah, because the cost of security as opposed to the cost of healthcare is really what we should be focusing on right now. Listen, a Gallup poll released on Monday finds that 62% of Americans believe that it is the responsibility of government to make sure that all Americans have healthcare. But sure, let's talk about the poor CEOs instead of the systemic change that we all desperately need and want. Let's scold the people who have no sympathy for a CEO who didn't have any sympathy for them or any of his victims. It is so infuriating. And you really begin to see what this is, right? When you hear more elites talk. This is class war. When you hear elites like Chris Cuomo, for example, who fell into a cushy media gig because his daddy was a governor, scold people for their reaction, that's when you know what we're seeing here is a class war.
Please believe me when I tell you the man who did this is not as scary as those celebrating what he did. I told you there is a new byproduct of magnified minorities on social media and appealing to the fringe on each side of the political spectrum relentlessly with millions of hits and data points and bits and scrolling again and again. And now we are bearing the fruit of the poisonous tree of division. This murderer decided to be a terrorist driven by a new fundamentalism that is taking root right here. Online, just go look for yourselves. There is a growing fan base for a felon. His name isn't just trending. Free him is trending in all caps and from time to time has more traction than the name itself. Now, most are anonymous, something we got to deal with when it comes to social media. I'm not sure how, but some are not. Can you believe wanting to openly endorse an assassination? I have never seen a killer celebrated before.
Are you sure about that, bud? Because you yourself celebrated the life of one killer. His name was George H.W. Bush.
President Bush's passing comes at a time that we profoundly need a reminder of the qualities that he made a constant. My prayer is that God welcomes his son and that his spirit may yet guide us to follow our better points of light. May we find ways, as he did, to illuminate the darkness with our diversity and our decency.
What's worse, celebrating a killer with a death count of 1 or celebrating a killer with a death count of thousands? I ask because in an article by Mehdi Hasan about George H.W. Bush's legacy, he details the war crimes that he committed as president. And yes, even though he was president, that doesn't make the murders he caused any less real. He dropped 88,500 tons of bombs on Iraq and Kuwait, and a single airstrike in Baghdad in 1991 killed more than 400 innocent Iraqi civilians, which was tantamount to a war crime according to Human Rights Watch. Not to mention, he deliberately targeted civilian infrastructure such as electricity plants and water treatment centers, as well as food processing plants and flour mills. So I don't know why Chris Cuomo claims that he's never seen a killer celebrated before, because he himself did just that. But I guess it doesn't count if it's a president or CEO. If their policies lead to deaths, doesn't matter, because social murder doesn't count to these people, right? If you react in a certain way to a CEO getting killed, well, you're a bad person because that person had a family, had hopes and dreams. You know, never mind the fact that the victims of his health insurance company had families with hopes and dreams. Every one of those Iraqi civilians that George H.W. Bush murdered had dreams and families. But, you know, George W. Bush and that CEO can't possibly be responsible for their deaths. George H.W. Bush didn't press the button to drop the bombs on those Iraqis himself, so he's innocent. But it's interesting that Chris Cuomo thinks that he has any moral authority on this matter, right? These people are all fucking hypocrites. But it comes back to Richsplaining. If you're poor, you don't get to feel a certain way about an oppressor dying. But if you're rich, you're allowed to pay tribute to mass murderers and ignore the death and destruction that they caused. And this news story really demonstrates the shamelessness of politicians and pundits. For example, take a look at some of the responses from Republicans about Luigi Mangione compared to Daniel Penny, the man who killed Jordan Neely on a subway. Just listen to the juxtaposition here.
If you're on the American left tonight, here's my chart. The good guys today, Daniel Penny. The bad guys, Luigi Mangione. It seems to me.
How do you?
Everybody
what's
on the
the
left,
chart for victims?
I'm just telling you what I see out in the world.
I know.
People on the left can't seem to tell the difference between the good guys and the bad guys.
Do you think that, as Congressman Crane does, that Daniel Penny should get the Congressional Gold Medal to recognize his heroism? I'm not asking you about anyone else.
I think he ought to get medal. I think they ought to build a statue to this guy.
The Instagram posts from nutbag people, which I was sent in the commercial break earlier, crazy. Like, he's cute, and people celebrating this. This is a sickness. Honestly, it's so disappointing, but I guess we shouldn't be surprised. Gentlemen, thank you so much. And up next, the other big news out of New York, Daniel Penny. A lot of people think he's a hero, and tonight he's not guilty. My take next.
Ooh, I wonder what her take on Daniel Penny is going to be. The suspense is killing me. But listen, I think I'm finally starting to get it now. If somebody kills a rich CEO who has the blood of thousands of innocent Americans on his hands, the killer is a bad guy who shouldn't be celebrated. However, if somebody chokes a mentally ill, unhoused black man to death, they're a hero and we should build statues honoring them. Killing poor black and brown people and innocent Americans, that's acceptable. Killing a rich CEO, that's not acceptable. Got it. In fact, Jesse Waters of Fox News is so against murder that he said on air that he hopes Luigi Mangione is murdered for committing murder.
This guy's not ready. He's way too soft. He's going to get annihilated on the inside, and good. If he's not going to get the death penalty, maybe someone will do him justice behind bars. That's all I have to say about that.
You should stop there.
Right.
Right, because I'm sure as soon as he enters Gen Pop, the other inmates are going to approach him and intimidatingly say, hey, man, do you want to know what we do to people who kill CEOs around here? I mean, these people are so out of touch. And again, I think it's worth restating the point that these people we're talking about here with these opinions all have salaries that insulate them from bankruptcy or death in the event their insurance claims are denied. They have enough money to pay out of pocket if they need to. But they don't want to talk about that. They want to make a moral judgment on the peasants that they look down on. And to be clear, these people are morally superior to no one. And they are deliberately avoiding the conversation we all want to have about healthcare because the health insurance CEOs who advertise their predatory Medicare Advantage plans to Fox News' elderly audience probably wouldn't be too happy if they actually started to talk about how their entire business model is a fucking scam. Having said that, though, some pundits are choosing to have actual conversations about the real issue, which is our for-profit healthcare system, which we all hate. That is why everybody is having this response on the left and on the right. So on MSNBC, Joy Reid spoke to progressive Tom Hartman, who explained why America never adopted a single-payer healthcare system like the rest of the developed world. Right now, I think it's obvious to most people why politicians don't want to do that. Health insurance companies have basically bribed politicians through lobbying and campaign contributions to keep it as it is. But big money wasn't as prominent in American politics as it is now. So the question is, why did politicians before never adopt this system? And unsurprisingly, it was because of racism.
And in particular, with healthcare, the history of the American healthcare system is absolutely shocking. We are the only country in the developed world that doesn't recognize healthcare as a right, as a human right, and doesn't cover every single person in the country. 25 million people in America have no health insurance whatsoever, and roughly half of us are radically underinsured. And that just is something that no other country would tolerate. And it goes back to a fellow named Frederick Hoffman. In 1887, Germany got the world's first single-payer healthcare system. Hoffman came over to the United States and got a gig as vice president of the Prudential Insurance Company. And in 1896, he published a book called Race, Traits, and Tendencies of the American Negro. And his argument was that black people were genetically inferior, and therefore, if we simply denied them health care, eventually, within a few generations, all black people would die out, and this would solve the race problem in America. His book was one of the best-selling books in America from 1896 to around 1930. He testified before Congress dozens of times. He testified before all kinds of states. Prudential put him on a nationwide tour. He was the reason why Harry Truman's effort at single-payer health care was shot down. He was the reason why FDR's effort at single-payer health care was shot down. And he was long dead in 1965 when Medicare came along, but his teachings were actually cited as one of the reasons why there's a 20% hole in Medicare, so that poor people, read that in the South as poor black people, would show up at the hospital and would thus integrate the doctor's office. I mean, that's how we got a privatized healthcare system rather than essentially a socialized healthcare system like everybody else has, where the government makes sure that everybody is covered. It's just an insane story. I wrote a book about the hidden history of American healthcare, and I was just astonished when I learned this backstory.
And this in part is why Republicans in particular focus so much on the so-called culture war. Because if they can get one half of the country to hate the other half of the country for no good reason, because of immutable characteristics or their identities, then they'll reject social welfare policies that they desperately need themselves just to make sure that the people they hate don't get them. This is why you have to reject racism and xenophobia and transphobia and all the other isms, and you have to join forces with other working class Americans and see each other as equals. Because as you've noticed, elites, they have class solidarity. Throughout this video, I've talked about conservatives and liberals, and as you can tell, they all have the same opinion about Luigi Mangione. And even though they may have disagreements here and there about certain policies, they're able to put aside those differences at the end of the day because these elites know that they have more in common with each other and that CEO than they have with any of us. So the question is, if they have class solidarity, why don't we?